Hi YouTube, and welcome to the part 2 of the how it works about the SU Carburettor. So this episode's all about talking about generalistics of carb calibration. So the first part was covering the facets of a typical carburettor, things you need to look out for, controls, etc. Clearly I am using an HS4 for this series of videos, so other carburettors have their controls in slightly different positions, but the fact is the carburettors all have the same controls, they're just laid out in a different way. Anyway, this particular part's going to really focus on the things you need to consider and how you go about calibrating an SU. Just before we get into the main video, I just want to add a section in here to answer a question or a couple of questions that have been asked about ported vacuum on the first video. So, and namely, what's the difference and why was it done? So those are perfectly good questions. So anyway, here we go. I'll explain to the best of my knowledge. So what it's for is to basically differentiate between vacuum and no vacuum when you're idling. Okay, so when the engine's idling, there's two means of getting the ignition timing, the required ignition time into the engine. That is obviously the static advance that's dialed in on the distributor when you turn the distributor. There's also some distributors, when you're idling, also have some mechanical advance because they've got a light spring and they're already partially on the advance curve, and that also adds a degree of advance when the engine's running. And then you've got the vacuum unit. Now, clearly the vacuum unit will only work or will only advance the timing if there's vacuum present. So by having ported vacuum, where the nozzle on the carburetor is behind the butterfly prevents the vacuum from the manifold reaching that vacuum orifice. So therefore there is no vacuum applied to the vacuum unit, and therefore there is no vacuum advance. And there's no advance to the timing. So the timing setting is basically a function of the position that you set the distributor in, and also any mechanical advance that the distributor is designed to deliver at idle RPM. So the question was asked is why would you want a situation where it's like that as opposed to having manifold vacuum where you've got a lot of vacuum on and a lot of advance on idle? And there are a number of schools of thought, but in the UK, when these were built, the reality of that situation is if you have manifold vacuum on a mild engine such as a factory standard engine, you get quite a lot of vacuum, about 20 degrees at idle, 20 inches of mercury at idle. And what that basically means is that will advance the vacuum unit to the fully advanced position, which on a factory vacuum can be 16 to 20 degrees quite easily. So that will add 16 to 20 degrees of crank advance to whatever you've got set on your idle position. So if you've got 10 degrees static and you're adding another 20 degrees, you've got 30 degrees at idle. Now, the problem with 30 degrees at idle is your hydrocarbons go up, because actually that's lighting the mixture off at that speed a little bit early, so you get what they call misfiring happening, where incomplete combustion happens. And when I mean misfiring, I don't mean misfire as in like it doesn't fire. I mean it's effectively not firing and burning all the mixture completely, so you end up with a higher hydrocarbon reading. So that's the reason why when you're trying to pass emissions, you don't want that. Now, moving on, why did the factory do that then with factory cars and they had manifold vacuum? Well, there's a simple reason for it, and the point is, when you are making a range of vehicles, you want to differentiate between the mundane cars, the economical mundane cars, and maybe the performance versions. And the performance versions would have could have the same engine or very similar engine specification, but would have a different timing curve depending on how the manufacturer wanted that model to deliver its performance. So let me give you an example. So if you talk about an economy model, which is what we find when I do a couple of the metro, for examples, the metros that I've done, there's a particular way that the factory used to set the timing. and they used to give the engine an inadequate advance curve for maximum performance. And then they would set the engine up so it would run on part throttle economy. So what they basically did with that is to have effectively retarded ignition advance, mechanical advance in the distributor. They would then add a lot of vacuum advance. So when you was at any light throttle position, your engine ran very efficiently, very economically. But when you put your foot down to make it go, it was flat. Okay, so therefore, when you drive the car, it feels great when you're just touching the throttle, driving around town or cruising, and it's very good on fuel. But when you put your foot down, it feels flat, performance is lackluster, and the car just doesn't get up and go. Whereas on the more performance-orientated models like the MG Metro, for example, or the RSP Cooper, it was given a mechanical advance curve to make the engine get up and go when you put your foot down. And therefore, what you would have with the situation is when you put your foot down on those engines, there was the mechanical advance there to make the engine wake up and go. And in terms of ported and manifold vacuum, the factory would typically use manifold vacuum in a lot of those performance applications purely because it gave them the best economy. Okay, and emission standards at the time meant the engines still passed those emissions tests. As time went on, things changed. They become more difficult to pass these tests, so therefore I now use ported vacuum. So when the engine is idling, it needs a certain ignition advance angle to run cleanly. So when I provide my engines with a new carburetor, I have ported vacuum, and I combine it with a modified distributor so that the engine gets the right advance when it's idling, and it gets the right vacuum angle applied to it when it's at part throttle, so we get good economy. Yet when you put your foot down, the vacuum drops, the vacuum unit ceases to add any advance, and it retards the ignition back to the full power timing curve that's in the distributor. The engine not only goes at part throttle efficiently, but she hauls ass when you put your foot down and you get the full power. So that's the reason why I do it. So hopefully that helps people understand. Without further ado, let's crack on with this episode of the video. Okay, so going back to our demonstration carburetor, one of the first things you need to understand about trying to use one of these and to get the calibration right is you need to use the correct size for the application. So it's no good using a very small carburetor on a very large engine, because you will find that the signal produced by the engine, and what I mean by signal, that's the intake pulses, not the average airflow. So the signal produced by the engine can play havoc with your carburetor settings. Now the reason for that is because the jet assembly, the needle and jet assembly, is sensitive to pulsed airflow. So the bigger the pulse from the engine, the more it can pull off, more fuel it can pull out of that jet. So as I alluded to in the last video, there's average airflow and then there's pulsed airflow, and we'll cover that a little bit more as we go through the calibration. But the important thing to note at this point is, avoid having small carburetors on large engines. Now I know a lot of very old engines, vintage, would typically have carburetors that were very small for the size, and that's because those engines were very low speed. But in the terms of what I'm talking about for typical performance or carburetor conversions. So if you have a 2 litre engine or 2.5 litre engine, and you've got a HIF 44, for example, it's getting a big carb for that. A big engine for that carb to work properly on, and that's where your carburetor would be significantly different in terms of specification for one that would work on a smaller engine, say a 1275 A series, for example. Anyway, so as I say, the first thing to worry about is making sure you've got the right carb. Now, as I also alluded to, there's the right specification of carburetor. So what I mean by that is there are differences in castings, and differences in airflow patterns through carburetors. Okay, so fitting a carburetor designed for a Mini or a 1275 Mini, for example, as I've already alluded to, fitting it to a 2-litre engine, you will have problems. And typically that normally manifests itself as going rich on overrun and things like that. So, you know, don't just take a carburetor from a smaller engine and fit it on a bigger engine and expect everything to be perfect, because it won't. The carburetor needs to be matched to the size of the engine, and that's not just this, that is in terms of its internal specifications and the parts fitted and the castings used, because they are different for those larger applications. So in terms of calibrating, if you want one of these to work properly, pick the right size, for example. So I'll give you some examples based on the classic A series. So if we talk about using a HS2 carburetor, the signal on that carburetor from the engine is quite large, so the calibration becomes quite sensitive. Very small changes to needle diameters, for example, make quite large changes to the actual fueling that the engine sees. So the carburetor becomes generally more sensitive the smaller it is. So if we have a 998 classic A series and we fit a HS4 carb, you'll find that the calibration is sensible and within the realms of what the carburetor can handle, because it's about the optimum size for that size engine. Now obviously if it's a tuned engine or a standard engine, that matters not. The point is this carburetor, this HS4 for example, is perfectly able to supply the fueling for that in all but full race applications, for example. So the most important thing to understand is the carburetor needs to function correctly and be able to control the fueling in all conditions. And what are all conditions? Well, all conditions aren't just foot flat on the floor, okay, at full power running. That's only just one aspect. What I mean by all conditions are idling, overrun conditions, high vacuum overrun, part throttle at all speeds. So part throttle at very low speeds, part throttle at very high speeds. So the carburetor has to be the correct size to work in all those applications. And that sometimes means that your carbs may struggle if they are too large or they are too small. So for example, if you've got a relatively standard 1275 A series and you fit twin HS4 carburetors, for example, you will find it will become quite difficult to achieve a perfect air-fuel ratio from part throttle to full power running, because the carburetors are effectively a little bit large for that application, so they start to work at extremis of what they're able to do. So as I say, having the appropriate size carbs for the capacity of the engine you're dealing with is very important. So moving on, now we talk about calibrations, and what people think most normally about calibrations is actually setting the carb up to fuel properly. So the important thing to understand here is that there are a number of facets to getting the fuel room right. If you're a frequenter of many forums online, you'll find people asking questions about oil, asking questions about needles, and sometimes dampers, and usually less frequently the carburetor spring. Well, the point is all of them are asking the wrong question. And the point is, and that's because the way the carburetor needs to be calibrated, okay? So the SU Carburettor has to be calibrated in a certain way because of the way it functions. So you can't just go straight in with changing needles because you're missing the point, all right? The first thing that you need to set when you put this on an engine is the spring inside the carburetor. Okay, so if we remove the top of the carburetor, just put that to one side, remove the piston from the suction chamber, and then we'll find the spring. So if I just put those pieces there for now, we can concentrate on the spring. What's it there for? Well, its main job is to set the depression, which is basically then required, the amount of airflow that is required to lift the piston. So obviously the stronger the spring, the more air needs to pass under that piston to create a stronger depression, which then evacuates more air above the piston, which causes it to rise. So basically, it effectively sets the range of airflow which the carburetor will operate in. And there are a number of different types of spring. Now, the observant of you will notice that this one's got paint on the end. And the reason why it's got paint on the end is because it identifies the rate of the spring. And there's blue springs, red springs, yellow springs, and green springs. And what these basically do, and I'll just bring some examples. That's a blue spring. That's a yellow spring. I don't have a green one handy. Here's another example of a blue spring. And here's an example of a stretch spring, which what people do to carburetors thinking that they're actually tuning them. And I'll explain why that is nothing more than a bodge in a while. We'll come back to that later. So, the spring sets the airflow requirements, or sets the airflow range of which the engine operates in. So effectively, the reason why this carburetor has a red spring is because it's used in applications where the piston will rise to its full extent in and around that used on classic 998 minis. Okay, so the only reason you will change the spring is if you run out of range. And what that normally means is when you're running an engine, and the way to select a spring is there's two things to think about. When you're running that engine at full power, that piston needs to be all the way up to the top of its range, the farthest it can go up. Now, if it reaches the full position just as you're reaching full power, then everything is good, because the piston is still lifting and presenting a larger and larger jet area to the airstream, purely because you're presenting more and more taper to the jet as it's lifting. Now, a lot of times problems happen on cars where people have modified the engine and it demands more air. So what that will basically mean is potentially the piston will be at full rise before the engine has reached its full power. And what that will mean is once it hits the top, you can't present more jet area. Okay, your jet area is then fixed because your needle's not moving, so your taper's not changing, and therefore what will happen is a high-speed lean out, because effectively this will become full open, and then your mixture will head towards lean as the revs rise. So this is a situation you want to avoid, because this is a classic lean out situation where you end up melting a piston at high RPM and high load because you're not continuing to maintain the fueling as the power climbs. So that's the reason why you need to make sure you've got the right spring. And this is where the classic stretch the spring happens, okay? Because what happens when you stretch a spring is it pushes more depression on the piston, which basically means it takes more airflow for the piston to rise, and you increase the depression over the jet, which pulls off more fuel for a given needle. So what that basically means is people stretch these in the vain hope that they're actually going to get more performance. But actually what they might find is this affects the needle all the way up the rev range. Using a proper spring and a proper spring change means that going from a red to a yellow, for example, the initial movement of the damper is very similar to, let's say, the red spring. So therefore, the fueling doesn't become much richer and the lower openings, which is very important if you're calibrating an engine that's, say, quite a small engine, and therefore when it comes up on cams it needs to go quite rich at the other end of the rev range. So this is how you can account for that. The other reason why you would need to change the spring rather than stretching it is because the rate at the top end would be much higher than it would be on a stretched one. So the rate on the springs is different. So stretching a spring is a bodge really, and it's not recommended to get the best fueling curves out of your application. So what happens if we fit a spring that's too strong, say like a yellow? So this has happened on a couple of occasions when I've been out on the road. There's been a yellow spring in the carburetor. Now basically what that happens is, if it's on a small engine, what will happen is the piston will open, but it won't open all the way. And clearly, if it's in an engine, or if it's in your carburetor, and that doesn't open all the way, what it's actually going to do is make a hindrance, okay? And what I mean by that is, if your throttle is wide open, yet the airflow is insufficient to move the piston up, that piston becomes a restriction. And therefore your carburetor won't let the engine produce full power because your piston is not moving up out of the way of the airstream. So it's very important to get the right spring, and it's also very important to change the spring first. And the reason for that is because that obviously sets the depression over the jet, which is then has a symbiotic relationship with the needle. So the spring and the needle work together. So the more spring you fit, or the stronger the spring you fit, the richer a given needle becomes. So effectively, if you've got 4 different springs, each needle therefore turns into 4 different fueling profiles, okay? The stronger the spring, the richer the needle becomes. It's as simple as that. So choose the spring as the very first step in tuning your carburetor. Now, if you get to a point where you're on a dyno, for example, and you can see that after tuning your engine, and you've got a more favourable airflow, air-fuel ratio from when you started, and now the engine runs all the way up the rev range, and you can see this piston is hitting the top before the engine gets there, you may have to go back and change the spring, and in which case changing the spring will mean that you'll have to go back and recalibrate the needle. So I have had a number of people say to me, I've tuned it on a red spring and then I've changed it to a yellow spring and it doesn't go as well. Well, it doesn't go as well because the calibration's now out. So the calibration needs to be done on the needle with the appropriate spring fitted. If you change the spring, the needle needs to be reprofiled. It's as simple as that. Now, the other thing the spring has an effect on is if you're at low speed and you put your foot hard down, the carburetor can do a thing what I call gasping, which is there's so much air demand it just forces the piston to go open. Now, if there's insufficient spring to control that, basically it will come open, and you'll get on an air fuel ratio curve. It will gasp. Okay, so let's go over to the whiteboard and I'll explain what I mean. Okay, so back over to my now infamous graph. So what we've got there is the usual graph that you've seen in deep dive videos before. So in the middle of the graph represents lambda 1, okay? On the bottom's RPM, up the side, the further up we go, the richer the fuel becomes. And there's 2 lines on the graph, that's obviously lambda, and the red line represents bore wash. So what typically happens when you've got insufficient spring in your carburetor application is, although your fueling might be absolutely perfect for part throttle running, when you put your foot down at low speeds, it does this. And what I mean by that is, because there's insufficient spring pressure, what happens is the piston flies up. And at the moment it does that, you've got a low speed engine with quite a large change in the surface area of the jet. And what that does is it basically causes the engine to go rich, very rich, and then that may even cause a misfire. But usually what happens, it just goes rich, but momentarily peaks and then comes back down into the full power area. But it's not a straight line. It'll keep going and the piston's full open, and then it reaches the top and the engine just leans out. So changing the spring often results in this happening. So yes, it goes richer, but now the spring is able to control the fueling, and it's able to control it, and then the piston can rise at the normal rate all the way up to the full end of the rev range, which means you get this nice flatter line. Obviously the line shape is dependent on the needle, but the most important thing is the piston is able to move within that range because it's strong enough to control the surge, but it's also strong enough to allow the piston to reach, keep moving all the way up to its full open point at the time the engine's at full power. And that's important to understand. The reason why you're changing the spring is to enable the carburetor to work properly, more like this rather than like that. Now, people will set cars up like that, professionals will set cars up like that because they run okay. Yeah, they might run okay, but they don't run strong, especially when the needle and the spring is chosen to give you the proper fueling curve under full power conditions. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed that. That's the end of part 2 of the How It Works Carburetor, SU Carburettor series. Again, any questions, please leave them in the down below in the comments, and I'll try and answer them verbally in part 3 of the video. Anyway, hopefully this has been useful, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. As ever, please like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you soon. Thank you very much.